November 12, 1942. Richmond, California. The morning fog still clung to the steel skeletons of ships along the bay, when thousands of workers gathered around the launching ways of Yard Number 2. The air was sharp, heavy with the scent of welding smoke and the salt of the Pacific. Before them stood a 441-foot cargo vessel, her grey hull towering over the crowd like a newly forged monument of war. She was the SS Robert E. Peary, a Liberty ship, one of hundreds being built to feed the Allies' desperate lifeline across the Atlantic. But this ship was different. She had been built from keel to completion in 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes. To those present, it seemed like magic. To the engineers, it was madness turned into method. For centuries, shipbuilding had been a slow and proud art. Riveters, draftsmen and carpenters worked for months, sometimes years, to bring a vessel to life. The construction of a single ship demanded a choreography of craftsmanship that no one dared to rush. In the age of sail, such work was measured in seasons. In the modern era, in months. Yet on this cold November morning, the impossible had happened. A vessel that would have taken half a year to complete had risen from raw steel and sweat in less than 5 days. Her launch drew reporters, naval officers, and factory workers alike. Many had doubted it could be done, and most still didn't believe it even as they saw her ready to touch the water. The Liberty ship program itself had been born from desperation. In 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The U-boats of Admiral Dönitz had unleashed a relentless campaign across the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. By the spring of 1941, more than 4 million tons of Allied shipping lay at the bottom of the sea. Convoys carrying food, fuel and ammunition were shredded before reaching British ports. Without supplies, Britain's ability to fight and survive would collapse. Winston Churchill later admitted that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. The solution would not come from admirals or generals, but from engineers and laborers. If Germany sought to destroy the sea lanes through speed, America would rebuild them through even greater speed. Henry J. Kaiser was the man who promised to make that happen, a man who had never built a ship before in his life. He was 58, stocky, ambitious, and known across America for constructing impossible things. The Hoover Dam, the Grand Coulee Dam, and massive highways through deserts and mountains. But when the British came calling for help in 1940, Kaiser offered something no one else dared, a plan to mass-produce cargo ships as if they were automobiles. To the seasoned shipbuilders of the East Coast, the idea was absurd. To Kaiser, it was inevitable. He believed that America's industrial might could be unleashed not through tradition, but through innovation. That philosophy was embodied in the Robert E. Peary. Her creation was a test of the system Kaiser had built from scratch in Richmond, a system based on assembly line principles. Prefabricated sections were welded instead of riveted, moved by cranes instead of human hands, and joined together with military precision. Each worker knew one task and one task only. The yards ran day and night under floodlights, their furnaces roaring like living creatures. Every step was timed, measured, and improved upon. Nothing was left to chance. When the Peary slid into the bay that morning, her steel hull glistening with condensation, a thunderous cheer rose from the crowd. Cameras flashed. The ship's whistle blared across the water. For a moment no one spoke. Even the engineers stood in stunned silence. 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes, a record so astounding that naval officials initially refused to believe it. But the proof was there, floating before their eyes. The impossible had been achieved not by a miracle, but by the power of organization, by thousands of ordinary Americans working together with a single purpose. That launch was more than a triumph of engineering. It was a declaration of industrial warfare. From that day forward, the world would learn that America's greatest weapon was not its tanks or planes. It was its ability to produce, to outbuild, and to outlast. The Robert E. Peary was no mere ship. She was a symbol, a grey steel promise that the Allies would never again run out of hope, or out of ships. In the early months of 1940, as Europe burned under Nazi conquest, an unlikely figure sat in his Oakland office, studying blueprints that had nothing to do with dams, highways, or concrete. His name was Henry J. Kaiser. At 58, he was already a legend of American construction. the man who had carved the Hoover Dam from desert rock, who had built the Grand Coulee and paved thousands of miles of roads across the continent. Yet now, amid the thunder of war overseas, Kaiser's ambitions had turned toward the sea, an arena in which he had no experience, no background, and no allies. Shipbuilding, the old guard believed, was a sacred craft passed down through generations. To think an outsider could master it was unthinkable. But Kaiser had never been one to ask permission from tradition. Across the Atlantic, Britain was desperate. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. The British merchant fleet, once the lifeblood of an empire, was vanishing beneath the waves. The island nation needed ships, and it needed them now. When the British government approached the United States for help, most shipbuilders hesitated. The process was too slow, too expensive, and too rigid to meet wartime demand. That was when Kaiser stepped forward with a proposal that defied logic. He would build cargo ships in half the usual time, using workers who had never built one before. The U.S. Maritime Commission was skeptical, to put it mildly. Henry Kaiser was a man of concrete, not steel, a builder of dams, not destroyers. But behind his calm confidence lay something they could not ignore, a track record of making the impossible happen. He had mobilized armies of workers to build massive public works during the Great Depression, and he had done it with efficiency that bordered on obsession. Where others saw obstacles, Kaiser saw systems, a way to organize human effort into predictable, repeatable results. To him, a ship was no different from a dam or a bridge. It was an engineering problem waiting to be solved. So in December 1940, the US government handed him his first challenge: 30 cargo ships for the British in 2 years. Kaiser didn't even have a shipyard yet, but within weeks he chose the site, a stretch of mudflats on the shore of Richmond, California. His rivals laughed. The ground was unstable, the tides unpredictable, and the nearest trained shipbuilder was 50 miles away. But Kaiser wasn't planning to build ships the old way. He was about to invent a new one, where traditional shipyards relied on slow linear assembly, one ship at a time, each crafted piece by piece. Kaiser envisioned an industrial process that mirrored Detroit's automotive factories. He brought in his chief engineer, Charles Clay Bedford, a man fresh from the automobile industry, who had seen Ford's assembly lines produce thousands of cars a day. Together, they devised a plan so radical that even the Maritime Commission called it reckless. They would build ships not from the keel up, but from prefabricated sections, entire chunks of the hull welded together like parts of a machine. Welding, at that time, was viewed with deep suspicion by old shipwrights. Riveting had been the standard for centuries, tried, tested, and trusted. Welding was faster, cheaper, and stronger in theory, but it was also unproven. British experts warned that welded hulls might crack in cold waters. Many American engineers dismissed it as dangerous, but Kaiser pressed forward. He believed that speed was a weapon, and in war weapons had to evolve. If we can't outgun them, he said, we'll outbuild them. When construction began in early 1941, skeptics predicted disaster. Yet the Richmond yard grew with astonishing speed. Massive cranes rose from the mud. Railroad tracks snaked across the site to carry prefabricated parts. Welding torches replaced hammers and rivets, and most importantly, Kaiser began hiring workers not from the shipbuilding trades, but from every corner of the civilian world. Teachers, clerks, farmers, mechanics, and housewives. You don't need experience, his recruiters told them. You'll learn by doing. It was an act of faith in ordinary Americans, and it worked. Within months, these so-called amateurs were welding with precision and assembling hulls faster than anyone thought possible. Kaiser's system transformed chaos into rhythm, work into music. Every crane, every torch, every man and woman moved in perfect tempo. The old guard scoffed that it wasn't shipbuilding at all. But Kaiser didn't care. He wasn't building ships. He was building a process, a revolution in steel. By the end of 1941, as the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and the United States plunged into war, the Richmond yards were already humming day and night. Kaiser had defied the skeptics. The outsider had become indispensable. And though few yet realized it, the method he had invented, mass production applied to shipbuilding, would soon change the very course of the war. By the spring of 1941, The quiet shoreline of Richmond, California, had transformed into a landscape of thunder and fire. What had once been empty marshland now pulsed with the sound of progress. The hiss of welding torches, the clang of steel plates, the rumble of cranes that stalked the shipways like mechanical giants. Henry Kaiser's vision had materialized faster than anyone thought possible. In less than a year, a full-scale shipyard had risen from the mud, a city of steel designed not for craftsmanship, but for speed. The Richmond Shipyard wasn't a traditional naval yard. It looked more like an industrial experiment, a cross between a Ford plant and a battlefield. Everything about it defied maritime convention. Instead of one or two ships being built slowly, bow to stern, the yard was divided into multiple building ways, each capable of handling an entire vessel simultaneously. Massive prefabrication sheds surrounded the site, where hull sections, decks, and engine housings were welded together long before ever touching the slipway. Railroad tracks crisscrossed the complex, carrying pre-built steel components weighing hundreds of tons from one assembly point to another. And everywhere, workers, thousands of them, moved with a rhythm that mirrored the heartbeat of an army on a war footing. Kaiser's design philosophy was simple yet revolutionary. Build ships like cars, not cathedrals. Every task, no matter how complex, was broken down into smaller, repeatable actions that anyone could learn quickly. In traditional shipyards, skilled riveters worked for years before mastering their craft. In Richmond, Kaiser's trainers turned total novices into efficient welders in less than 2 weeks. "Oh, you don't need a master," Kaiser insisted. "You need a method." It was that belief that a system could outperform tradition that would turn Richmond into one of the greatest industrial miracles of the 20th century. Yet the maritime establishment was horrified. Vice Admiral Emory Land, chairman of the U.S. Maritime Commission, initially dismissed Kaiser's project as mechanical fantasy. Welding, he warned, was unreliable. Ships built this way might crack apart in heavy seas. The British Royal Navy had banned welded hulls altogether, fearing catastrophic failure. But for Kaiser, the risk of inaction was greater than the risk of innovation. The Atlantic was a graveyard. U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. If America stuck to tradition, the war would be lost before it was truly fought. Kaiser's argument was brutally pragmatic. The Germans are using machines to destroy ships. We'll use machines to build them faster than they can sink them. Inside the Richmond yards, the revolution took shape. Every crane swing, every spark, every weld was timed, measured, and optimized. Prefabricated hull sections, sometimes larger than houses, were welded together on open ground, then hoisted into place by overhead cranes capable of lifting 150 tons. Instead of a slow linear process, construction became parallel production. While one crew welded the hull, another assembled the engine, another built the superstructure, and another wired the control systems, all at once. The results were staggering. The first Liberty ship from Richmond took 197 days to complete. The next one, 169. Then 128. By early 1942, the average construction time had dropped below 70 days. To the old shipyards on the East Coast, it was unthinkable. To Kaiser, it was just the beginning. The workforce itself was unlike anything the industry had ever seen. They came from every corner of America. Farmers from Oklahoma, housewives from the Bay Area, former clerks and teachers who traded paper and pens for torches and hammers. For many, it was their first real job. For others, it was a second chance. Kaiser's recruiters promised training, good pay, and a role in the fight against fascism. They delivered all three. By late 1941, more than 10,000 people worked in the Richmond yards. Fewer than 200 had ever set foot in a shipyard before, but they learned fast. The tasks were simple, specific, and endlessly repeated. One worker might weld only vertical seams for months. Another might assemble nothing but stairways or hatch covers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was efficient. The shipyard became an orchestra of movement and flame, each worker playing a single note in a massive industrial symphony. As the months passed, skepticism began to fade. Liberty ships rolled out of Richmond faster and faster, each one a steel rebuttal to doubt. The press began to take notice. Journalists called it the miracle at Richmond. Admirals called it industrial warfare. Henry Kaiser called it simply progress. By the time America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Richmond was no longer just a shipyard. It was a weapon, a factory of freedom. Every new hull sliding into the bay meant thousands of tons of supplies, tanks, and ammunition bound for the front. Every rivet replaced by a weld meant a day saved, a life spared, a convoy completed. From the mudflats of California, Henry Kaiser had done what no admiral, no general, no industrial magnate before him had achieved. He had turned the art of shipbuilding into the science of mass production. The war in the Atlantic would still be long and brutal, but now, for the first time, the Allies had something the Axis could never match, a shipyard that built faster than war could destroy. By early 1942, the Richmond Shipyards had become a thunderous heartbeat of the American home front. From dawn until deep into the night, the air vibrated with the pulse of industry. The shriek of cranes, the crackle of welding torches, the hum of rail cars carrying steel plates as large as the walls of a house. The Liberty ships, once dismissed as ugly ducklings, were beginning to emerge in record time. Yet behind the triumph lay a struggle of fire, metal, and sheer human will. Henry Kaiser had promised speed, but speed in the world of steel was not a gift, it was a battle. The great experiment of Richmond hinged on a single technological gamble, welding instead of riveting. For centuries, ships had been held together by rivets, millions of tiny metal fasteners pounded into red-hot holes by teams of expert riveters. It was slow, costly, and exhausting, but it worked. Welding, on the other hand, was faster and required fewer men, but it was dangerously untested. The heat could warp metal. The seams could crack under stress. In the cold waters of the Atlantic, where temperatures dropped below freezing, a single flawed weld could split a ship in two. To Kaiser, those doubts sounded familiar. He had heard them all before, at Hoover Dam, at Grand Coulee, in every project that pushed the limits of possibility. Every innovation, he said, is first called impossible until it's done. So he doubled down. He brought in metallurgists, engineers, and instructors from across the country to perfect the new art. Welding schools sprang up overnight across the Richmond complex. Men and women alike lined up to learn how to fuse steel with light and fire. They practiced on scrap plates until their seams gleamed smooth and strong. Instructors tested every weld, bending, breaking, and analyzing each one until the technique became second nature. The process was raw, dangerous, and mesmerizing. The shipyard's night sky glowed like a storm of stars as welders' arcs lit up the darkness, blue-white flashes scattering across the hulls of half-built ships. Workers called it the Northern Lights of Richmond. Each spark, each hiss of molten steel was a small defiance against the tyranny of time. But there were setbacks. In early 1943, several Liberty ships in the Atlantic suffered catastrophic hull fractures, some breaking clean in two without warning. The headlines were brutal. Critics of Kaiser's welding methods called it proof of recklessness. "The Liberty ships are cracking up," shouted one newspaper. Panic rippled through the Maritime Commission. The blame fell squarely on welding. For a moment it seemed the old guard had been right, that Kaiser's miracle might crumble into catastrophe. But where others saw failure, Kaiser saw data. He summoned his engineers and metallurgists to conduct a forensic investigation. What they discovered would change not only shipbuilding, but metallurgy itself. The cracks weren't caused by faulty welding. They were the result of brittle fracture, a phenomenon barely understood at the time. The steel used in Liberty ships under freezing temperatures became so rigid that any stress, even a small one, could cause sudden failure. It wasn't the welds that were weak. It was the metal itself. The discovery led to new steel alloys, new heat treatments, and new testing standards that would define modern naval engineering. Kaiser's team had turned crisis into breakthrough. Meanwhile, his workers refused to slow down. They took pride in their role, in the knowledge that every Liberty ship launched meant supplies for soldiers thousands of miles away. Welders began etching their initials into hidden seams, small signatures of patriotism burned into the bones of steel. They became known as the men and women of the torch. Many were young, barely 20 years old, and for the first time in history, nearly a third were women. Dressed in overalls and welding masks, they stood shoulder to shoulder with men, their faces lit by the glow of molten metal. They were the mothers of Rosie the Riveter and they proved that courage and competence knew no gender. Every day, Richmond's production rhythm intensified. Assembly line methods borrowed from Detroit fused with Kaiser's unrelenting drive. Prefabrication, modular construction, and welding efficiency combined into an unstoppable force. Ships that once took months were now measured in weeks, and eventually days. The shipyards became living organisms, evolving, learning, adapting, each one beating to the tempo of war. By late 1943, the impossible had become routine. The Richmond yards launched a new Liberty ship every 5 days. Elsewhere, Kaiser's techniques spread to other shipyards, Portland, Vancouver, and beyond, until the entire West Coast thrummed with the fire of his revolution. Welding was no longer a gamble. It was the new standard. The skeptics had been silenced. The impossible had been welded into reality. And as the Liberty ships sailed eastward, loaded with food, fuel, and weapons, the men and women who built them understood something profound, that wars were not won only by those who fought, but also by those who forged the means to fight. By 1943, Henry Kaiser's shipyards had become a world unto themselves, a living, breathing organism powered by sweat, steel, and unrelenting purpose. The Richmond shoreline no longer echoed with the stillness of tides, but with the constant roar of industry. Every morning, tens of thousands of men and women poured through the gates, their lunch pails clattering like sabers, their faces set with quiet determination. They weren't soldiers. They carried no rifles, wore no uniforms, and never stormed a beach. Yet in the great struggle of World War II, they were fighting every bit as fiercely as the men overseas. They were America's new kind of army, an army of civilians. At its peak, the Richmond Shipyards employed over 90,000 workers, a workforce larger than the population of many American cities. The sheer diversity of it was unprecedented. There were machinists from Detroit, lumberjacks from Oregon, cotton pickers from the South, schoolteachers from Ohio, and clerks from New York. There were men too old to fight, boys too young to enlist, and women who had never before worked outside their homes. For the first time in the nation's history, Americans of every race, gender, and class came together under one purpose: to build the ships that would carry freedom across the seas. It wasn't easy. Prejudice and division ran deep. In those early months, many refused to work side by side with people who looked or spoke differently. African Americans faced open discrimination. Women were told they lacked the strength for industrial labor. Immigrants struggled to be accepted. But Kaiser saw beyond that. To him, every willing hand was valuable. "We are all builders," he said, "and war gives no room for waste, not in material and not in people." He demanded fair wages and equal hiring standards. When traditional unions balked, he went around them. His goal was not just to build ships, but to build opportunity. And in the process, he created one of the most diverse and socially transformative workforces in American history. The shipyards became a place where boundaries blurred under the fire of purpose. White welders trained black apprentices. Housewives taught returning veterans how to cut steel. Teenagers worked night shifts beside retired farmers. On the assembly lines, the only thing that mattered was output: how fast, how strong, how well. The women of Richmond became the soul of this transformation. They came in dresses and aprons at first, uncertain of what waited inside. By the end of the week, they were dressed in coveralls and wielding torches like seasoned mechanics. They built engines, welded hulls, and riveted decks with precision that stunned even the most experienced foreman. Their presence reshaped the workforce, the culture, and the morale. Rosie the Riveter was no longer a poster. She was 1,000 real women, their hands blackened with soot, their spirits unbreakable. Many of them were mothers, juggling shifts and home life with unimaginable strength. Kaiser saw the strain and responded with another innovation: the first company-sponsored childcare centers in the nation. At the Richmond Shipyards, nurses and teachers cared for workers' children while their parents labored through the night. It was a revolutionary act of compassion amid the grind of war, and it allowed thousands of women to remain in the workforce when they might otherwise have been forced to leave. Kaiser also introduced prepaid medical care, a concept that would later evolve into Kaiser Permanente, one of America's largest health systems. His philosophy was simple but profound. A healthy worker was a productive worker. Medical clinics were established right inside the shipyards, offering round-the-clock treatment for injuries, fatigue, and illness. It was efficiency with a human heart, industrial progress bound to social welfare. The shipyards ran on discipline but also on spirit. At dawn, the sound of the yard whistle rolled across the bay like a battle cry. Crews swarmed over the hulls, welding and hammering, assembling each Liberty ship piece by piece. Sparks flew like showers of light. Giant hulls rose out of the slipways, their steel skins glowing orange in the sun. At night, the yard transformed into a landscape of flame and shadow, the Pacific wind carrying the smell of oil and metal into the dark. They worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, driven by the knowledge that every hour counted. Out at sea, convoys were fighting for survival against wolf packs of German U-boats. Every new ship launched from Richmond meant lives saved. Sailors brought home food delivered. Reinforcements arrived. It was a race between production and destruction, and Henry Kaiser's civilians were winning. By 1944, the Kaiser way had spread across America. The methods pioneered in Richmond, mass production, modular assembly, social innovation, became the template for dozens of shipyards nationwide. Together, they launched thousands of Liberty and Victory ships, transforming the U.S. merchant marine into the greatest logistical force the world had ever seen. Kaiser's workers didn't fight in the trenches or fly in the skies, but their labor made those battles possible. They were the unseen soldiers, the welders, riveters, engineers, and laborers who fought the war with flame and steel. Their battlefield was the shipyard. Their victory was measured in tonnage, and their legacy would endure long after the guns of war fell silent. By 1944, America's shipyards thundered like engines of destiny. Across the coasts from Portland to New Orleans, the rhythm was the same. Cranes swinging, welders blazing, hulls sliding into the sea. But nowhere was that rhythm more fierce, more relentless than in Henry Kaiser's empire at Richmond. What had begun as an untested gamble now stood as a monument to American ingenuity. The Liberty ship, once mocked as a slow, ugly freighter, had become a symbol of industrial salvation. And its creation, refinement, and unstoppable production would go down as one of the greatest logistical miracles of World War II. Every week, new ships rolled out of the yards with astonishing regularity. The first Liberty ships had taken months to complete, cautious, methodical experiments. But by 1944, the system Kaiser forged had matured into a weapon of precision. Prefabrication had been perfected. Welding techniques were standardized. Material supply lines ran like veins feeding a living creature. Each shipyard operated like an assembly line stretched across miles of coastline. Steel plates arrived by rail, were cut, bent, and welded into massive sections, hull sides, decks, bulkheads, then joined together in perfect sequence. It was not shipbuilding anymore. It was orchestration. The numbers were staggering. America was now producing nearly one Liberty ship every 8 hours. In Richmond alone, the 4 shipyards operated around the clock, launching vessels so frequently that the local papers stopped counting them individually. The pace was beyond comprehension, each launch accompanied by the blare of horns, the cheers of workers, and the champagne splash of christening bottles. Mothers, wives, and children of the shipyard laborers often served as sponsors, breaking the bottles on the hulls with trembling hands as thousands watched their work glide proudly into the Pacific. Every Liberty ship was 441 feet long, weighed 14,245 tons fully loaded, and carried 10,000 tons of cargo. Tanks, food, trucks, ammunition, oil, and the raw lifeblood of war. They weren't beautiful, and they weren't fast. Their engines pushed them barely 11 knots across the ocean, but they were built for one purpose: survival through simplicity. Straight lines, flat plates, and standardized components made them cheap and easy to assemble. Each one was designed to outlast torpedoes, storms, and time itself. Churchill called them the ships that won the war. Roosevelt called them ugly ducklings. History would call them miracles. Then came the record that would silence every skeptic. In November 1942, one of Kaiser's Oregon yards launched a Liberty ship named Robert E. Peary in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to completion. The world was stunned. Newspapers printed the time down to the minute. Newsreels showed crowds cheering as the freshly welded ship slid into the water, steam still rising from her seams. It wasn't just a feat of engineering. It was proof that America's industrial machine had achieved something no other nation could match. But Kaiser knew that this record wasn't just about speed. It was about unity. Every man and woman who worked on the Robert E. Peary had poured themselves into that ship. Thousands of hands, thousands of hours, all guided by one vision, to prove that what had once taken months could now take days. It was a statement of defiance to the Axis powers and a message to the Allied soldiers fighting abroad. America was behind you. Faster, stronger and unstoppable. The Liberty ships became the arteries of the Allied war effort. They carried vital cargo across the Atlantic and Pacific, sustaining armies from North Africa to Normandy. They delivered fuel for tanks, food for troops, and planes packed in crates ready for assembly overseas. Without them, D-Day would have been impossible. Each one risked the gauntlet of U-boats, Luftwaffe bombers, and storms that tore at their welded seams. Many never returned, yet for every Liberty ship sunk, 2 more took its place. It was industrial warfare at its purest, production as a weapon. As the number of ships grew, so too did their mythology. Sailors trusted them, commanders relied on them, and enemies feared their endless arrival. The Liberty ships were everywhere, in Arctic convoys bound for Murmansk, in Pacific Island supply chains, in the armadas that fed Patton's tanks and Eisenhower's invasion. Their simplicity made them immortal. Even when their hulls groaned and their engines failed, they could be repaired at sea, patched and sent back into the fight. The workers who built them said it best. We built ships that didn't quit, because neither did we. By war's end, 2,710 Liberty ships had been launched, more than any single class of vessel in history. They outnumbered, outlasted, and outperformed every expectation. The very thing that critics had mocked as crude and disposable had carried the Allies to victory. Henry Kaiser's dream, born on a muddy bay in California, had become the backbone of global logistics, a silent fleet that kept democracy alive through steel and sacrifice. When the final ship left the slipway, the workers gathered to watch it glide toward the horizon. There was pride in their cheers, but also silence, a shared understanding that what they had accomplished would never be repeated. They had not only built ships, they had built history. By mid-1944, the Liberty ships had become the lifeline of the free world. Every ocean swell carried their grey silhouettes, low, square, and unyielding, ploughing eastward through fog and flame. They were not glamorous like battleships, nor swift like destroyers, yet their importance eclipsed both. They were the invisible arteries that kept armies alive, the engines of freedom that fed the war effort across 2 hemispheres. Without them, no invasion could be mounted, no front sustained, no victory secured. From the industrial heartbeat of Richmond to the convoys threading the Atlantic, the Liberty fleet moved with mechanical precision. Each ship was a floating warehouse, stacked with the essentials of survival: grain, shells, jeeps, aviation fuel, medical supplies, and the millions of items soldiers needed every day. Their decks bore everything from Sherman tanks to locomotives. Their holds brimmed with wheat from Kansas and oil from Texas. The routes were long, the dangers constant, and yet the convoys never ceased. The Liberty ships became the veins through which Allied power flowed to every front line on Earth. Nowhere was there value more evident than in the Atlantic, the battlefield Churchill called the dominating factor of the war. German U-boats prowled the depths, hunting the merchant fleet that sustained Britain. Each voyage across the ocean was a gamble. Blacked-out ships crept through storm and darkness, while sonar pings echoed in the cold. The Liberty ships were easy targets, slow, bulky, and armed with little more than a single deck gun, but their strength lay in numbers. For every ship lost, 2 more joined the line. They could not be sunk faster than Kaiser's yards could replace them. It was the first time in modern warfare that production outpaced destruction. Their crews were civilians turned warriors, merchant sailors armed with courage and stubbornness. They faced torpedoes, mines, and the icy Atlantic with grim determination. Many never returned. Some were pulled from lifeboats after days adrift. Others vanished without trace beneath the waves. Yet even as they died, new ships bearing the same names steamed to sea. The Liberty fleet became an immortal relay of steel, one ship falling, another rising, each carrying forward the same banner of endurance. Beyond the Atlantic, the ships were equally indispensable. In the Pacific, they supplied the island-hopping campaigns, delivering fuel, aircraft, and construction equipment to the jungles and coral atolls where Marines fought inch by inch. They brought the raw materials for airstrips, hospitals, and naval bases that would stretch the reach of American power across the ocean. In the Indian Ocean and the Arctic, Liberty ships sailed under foreign flags as part of the Lend-Lease program, carrying American aid to Soviet ports and British colonies. Some flew the red ensign of Britain, others the hammer and sickle of Russia, but all bore the same American steel beneath their paint. The Axis understood the stakes. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet, watched in frustration as the flood of new ships drowned his campaign. "We have lost the Battle of the Atlantic," he confessed in 1943, "because the enemy's shipbuilding has outstripped our sinking." It was not only a tactical defeat, it was a moral one. For every torpedo that struck, 10,000 American workers struck back with torches and welds. The Liberty ship had become a weapon of strategy, as surely as any bomb or gun. In Washington, President Roosevelt hailed them as the bridge across the sea. Churchill, in his gravel voice, called them the foundation of our victory. Eisenhower would later write that without them, the Allies could not have landed, advanced, or survived. Every campaign, North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, the Philippines, was sustained by their unending flow of supplies. They were the quiet companions of every triumph, the unsung heroes of every advance. Inside the shipyards, the workers followed the news of each battle as if they were there themselves. When they heard of convoys reaching Murmansk, they cheered. When they learned of sinkings, they worked faster. The war had given them a sense of purpose larger than life. Each ship that slid down the ways carried a piece of their pride, and often their handwriting, scratched into hidden bulkheads. Built in Richmond. Built to win. By 1945, the Liberty fleet had carried more than 130 million tons of cargo across the world's oceans. They had endured storms, torpedoes, and fire, and they had delivered victory. The Allies had conquered not only through courage on the battlefield, but through mastery of production and logistics. The Liberty ship was the embodiment of that mastery, a machine born from democracy's need, powered by ordinary people and destined to outlast the war itself. When the guns finally fell silent, thousands of Liberty ships remained in service, still crossing oceans, now carrying food instead of ammunition, rebuilding the very world they had helped save. Many were scrapped, some converted to civilian use, but a few survived into the next century, rusted yet proud. Their welded hulls still bore the scars of battle and the fingerprints of those who built them. They had been more than ships. They were the proof that freedom could be manufactured, mass-produced, welded, launched, and sent forth by the hands of citizens who refused to yield. They were the engines of freedom, and their hum could still be heard long after the war ended. When the last echoes of war faded in 1945, the Liberty ships, those rugged, welded workhorses of the Allied victory, were expected to vanish with the conflict that had birthed them. They had been built for urgency, not longevity. They were called emergency ships, meant to serve for 5 short years before rust claimed their hulls. Yet as the smoke cleared and peace dawned, it became clear that Henry Kaiser and his fleet of ordinary builders had done something far greater than supply the Allies. They had rewritten the blueprint of modern industry. Across the globe, shipyards that had once laughed at Kaiser's methods now studied them with reverence. The techniques he pioneered, prefabrication, modular assembly, and large-scale welding, spread like wildfire. Japanese and Korean engineers, rebuilding their war-shattered industries in the 1950s, made pilgrimages to Richmond and Portland to learn how America had achieved the impossible. They returned home to build the shipyards of Nagasaki, Kobe, and Ulsan, the same yards that would later dominate global shipbuilding. The modern supertankers and container vessels of the 20th century were born from the ghost of the Liberty ship. Kaiser himself did not fade quietly into history. He saw beyond war into a world that still needed building. With the same boldness that had driven him to challenge maritime orthodoxy, he turned his energy toward peacetime transformation. The Fontana steel mill he had constructed to feed his shipyards became a cornerstone of California's post-war industrial growth. The cities that had swelled around his yards, Richmond, Vanport, Portland, became symbols of what mass mobilization could achieve. Where mudflats once stretched empty, thriving communities now stood, shaped by the labor and spirit of workers who had found new pride in their skills. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Liberty Ship program was not of steel or statistics. It was human. In Kaiser's shipyards, the old barriers of gender, race, and class had been broken out of necessity. Over 40,000 women had worked in his plants by 1944, some for the first time earning their own wages, their own independence. They were rosies with welding masks instead of rivet guns, proving that precision and endurance were not bound by gender. African-American workers, once excluded from skilled trades, rose to become welders, crane operators, and supervisors, transforming social expectations as much as industrial ones. The Liberty Ship became a vessel of equality as much as of war. When peace came, many of these workers refused to return to the shadows. They carried their experience into new industries, aviation, construction, manufacturing, bringing with them the discipline, teamwork, and confidence they had learned in the yards. They became part of a new American middle class, built not only by victory abroad but by revolution at home. The democratization of labor that began under the roar of shipyard cranes became a defining feature of the post-war economy. Even healthcare bore Kaiser's touch. During the war, he had recognized that his massive workforce needed reliable medical care to stay efficient. In partnership with physician Sidney Garfield, he created a prepaid healthcare system for his workers, an idea unheard of at the time. It ensured doctors were available, medicine was affordable, and preventive care replaced emergency treatment. This wartime experiment evolved into Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest and most successful healthcare organizations in the world. From the heat of the shipyards rose not just steel, but a new model for caring for the people who built them. By the late 1940s, Liberty ships still plied the seas, not as instruments of war but as carriers of commerce. Many were sold to foreign nations and commercial lines, their grey paint replaced by bright civilian colors. They hauled grain, coal, timber, and machinery across oceans, once ruled by warships. Some lasted decades longer than their designers intended. The SS John W. Brown and the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, both built in 1942, remain preserved to this day, living museums of the era when America welded its way to victory. Statistically, the numbers remain staggering even by modern standards. 2,110 Liberty ships were built across 18 shipyards in just 4 years, an average of nearly 2 ships per day. Kaiser's 7 yards alone accounted for more than half that total. The time to build a ship fell from 230 days to as few as 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, the record set by the Robert E. Peary. The mathematics of victory had never been so clear. Mass production had defeated meticulous craftsmanship, and good enough had proven to be the perfect weapon. In later decades, engineers, economists, and historians would look back on the Liberty Ship program as a defining moment in industrial civilization. Harvard's Michael Porter wrote that Kaiser demonstrated that industrial capability is not inherited, it is created. The Liberty program had shown the world that manufacturing limits were illusions imposed by habit, not by physics. Where old industries saw barriers, Kaiser saw processes waiting to be simplified. His genius was not invention, it was reimagination. Even Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, credited Kaiser's shipyards with winning the logistical war. "We fought across 5,000 miles of ocean," he wrote, supplied by ships built faster than the enemy could sink them. The Pacific War was won as much in Richmond as it was on Iwo Jima. Today, few of the Liberty ships remain. Most have been scrapped or rest-rusting in forgotten harbors. Yet their legacy endures, in every modern shipyard that uses prefabrication, in every assembly line that prizes efficiency over perfection, and in every factory where ordinary people achieve the extraordinary. They were born of war, but became the blueprint of peace. Henry Kaiser had once been an outsider, a builder of dams and highways, dismissed by the shipbuilding elite as a naive dreamer. Yet within 5 years he changed the world. His Liberty ships not only carried cargo, they carried proof that when human ingenuity and necessity converge, even the impossible can be manufactured. The Liberty fleet is gone, but its echo still hums in steel, in labor, in medicine. and in every mind that dares to question what impossible truly means. That is the legacy of steel, a revolution not just in industry, but in the belief of what ordinary people can accomplish when freed from tradition and united by purpose.